So again, I would like to welcome you all to this NECE campus session. It's great to see so many of you joining us today. Before we begin and before I invite our guest speaker, let me just say a few words about this incredibly interesting topic that we are addressing today. And what I'd like to begin with is actually a question, and that question is, what story are we telling the world about civil society? Because right now, as we know, in too many places, the loudest voices are not our own. Authoritarian populists have become such good narrators. Their narrative is not only good at attacking civil society, but they tell a compelling, often emotionally charged story that shapes how people think and feel about things like justice, democracy, and participation. And as civic educators and activists, we sometimes tend to over-focus on facts, reports, and policies, but the human brain doesn't work that way. People make decisions with their hearts as much as their heads. When we speak only in response to the attacks of others or chase the headlines, we often miss an opportunity, and that opportunity is basically to shape people's imaginations by showing them the values we stand for. So this is why we need to change how we communicate. We need strategies that are proactive and not reactive, narratives that show people not just what we are against, but what we are standing for, what we are building. In other words, we need to make hope visible and concrete. And of course, don't forget that this year's NECE topic is hope, and all our efforts are concentrated in bringing hope forward. And that brings me to today's guest, Thomas Coombes, the creator of hope-based communication. Influenced by his work at organizations such as Amnesty International and Transparency International, in 2017, Thomas launched hope-based communication as a practical approach to help civil society shift from reacting to reframing, and from crisis messaging to values-led storytelling. His work combines insights from psychology, neuroscience, and years of hands-on experience to help change makers around the world speak more effectively and more humanely about their mission. Today, he's with us to share his toolkit for working with difficult narratives and telling better stories that can move people. So, Thomas, we're super glad to have you here with us. The floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Camelia, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Really looking forward to spending this next hour with you. I'll just jump in and show you my slides, essentially. So my plan for today is to introduce hope-based communication to you and show you how you can use it. So like Camelia was just saying, the idea is that this is a tool that anyone working for social change can use. And so we don't operate as like an agency or an organization. We're actually just a community of different kinds of practitioners, social change people. I have more of a communication background, but there's loads of other people using it. And so we'll give you a little introduction today, talk a little bit about the brain science, give you some examples, and then hopefully you're interested to learn a little bit more. But so the key element of hope-based communication, it's based on these 5 simple shifts. So it's a tool I first started developing while I worked at Amnesty International in 2017, when we were faced with a lot of these challenges, like Camille was saying, this confirmation bias that facts or just referring to human rights or rule of law weren't really being very effective for us. And I realized, well, what is it we want the narrative to be? We were facing these negative narratives, but we didn't have a clear narrative strategy of our own. But what I also realized was you can't actually just go to your colleagues and allies in a movement and tell them what to say. And so the idea is that this is a tool for everyone to ask themselves what they want the narrative to be. So for example, I'm going to show you how that will work. But for example, last week I was doing a workshop with union organizers for gig workers. So for example, Uber drivers or food delivery or domestic workers. And there they were very focused on the problems they face in their day-to-day life that the tech companies are bringing for them. But so they were focused a lot on the problem, but that was bringing their message into a very technical area. And so it's a good reminder for me, actually, again, the power of this tool is what they need to be doing is constantly, when they talk about the problem, also telling people what the solution is. So I'll show you a little bit how this works. But the key piece here is I'm going to give you examples, but the goal is not for me to tell you or anyone I work with what their message should be, but to give people the tools to find them their own message and crucially apply it constantly. And so what we're going to see is narratives and also behavior changes through constant repetition. And so to do that, we have to be constantly coming back to whatever we want the narrative to be. So let's just get a few of the basics clear. So like Melly was saying, NECE, hope is a big priority for NECE. Oh, I got the pronunciation wrong, Camilla. You're going to have to fix me on this again later. But so what I just want to say is really important about hope. It's very different to being optimistic or positive. The idea is that hope is the idea that tomorrow can be better than today if we take action. So it's goal-directed thinking, right? So it's not about, oh, things are fine today. Optimism and positivity are these ways we see today. But actually, hope is something we need in dark times because we need to believe things can get better if we're going to act. And so that's already, the first thing. Sometimes people make an assumption is that it's about being positive. I'm actually not, sometimes we need negative, sometimes we need positive. But what we always need if we want to make change happen is the belief that that change is actually possible. And so from there, we get to this idea of, well, what does it actually mean to be hope-based? Again, it's not just doing positive communication. It's actually basing our work, whether that's activism or other social change work, on the change we want to see happen. I'm going to use the word activism throughout because actually what I'm going to talk about today is that for me, what I've learned doing hope-based communication for now 7 or 8 years, it's actually part of the mission I'm on is to redefine activism, right? That's not actually just, sometimes we might be working in organizations or in institutions and we don't consider ourselves activists or in my space, human rights defenders. But actually, if we're going to build, well, first of all, protect democracy, but also just live in societies where we take care of each other, actually we need to redefine activism, and it's about all of us shaping society. And so, yeah, I will look forward to hearing what you think of that. And by the way, please, as I'm going along, I'm not going to stop for questions, but I actually am really interested in hearing how you react to things and what your questions are. So please do put any reflections or questions you have in the chat, and we will come back to those at the end. So 5 shift. The key thing, again, I want to just reiterate in terms of how this works is the point is we have these things on the left that usually dominate our story. I'll show you how in a minute. And so what we need to do is bring in these other elements. So it's very important, again, to say right at the top, it's never about ignoring these things on the left. It's about actually bringing more into the story, the things you see on the right. So the way this tool works on a very practical level, we literally we would take a piece of paper and write a line down the middle, and we'll write down the things that are on the left. And it's actually very important, for example, to name our fears. That's one element of having control over them. But then we will also ask ourselves, well, what's the opposite of that? And we then will write down on the right what that is. And so that might mean a press release or a social media post. We might reframe it, use different words, but it might also lead us to actually a completely different strategy we need to implement. So that's what I'm going to show you. So the idea is it's a tool for just reframing how we see things day to day, but it's also a tool for actually recognizing that there are different strategies we need to implement in order to achieve the world we're trying to bring about. And there's actually a third element that I'm starting to increasingly see as I apply psychology and, interestingly, sports science and sports psychology to the work of social change people, that it's also just a tool about our own mindset. So today I thought I'll tell you a little bit about some of those, which is kind of like the future or the next evolution of hope-based communication. So yeah, as I was saying, there's a key element here is that when we talk about hope-based, it's actually a very science-based tool. And what is interesting though is I mean, I'm curious if this is familiar to you, but we work in the realm of in social change, we're dominated by people from legal profession, politics, in my case, history and human rights law. And a lot of these fields, the motivation is about improving how we humans treat each other, but we're not actually drawing on the science of how humans behave. So I think this is a big sort of trend that's going to start changing. So I'm very excited to be involved with the civics and starting to look at actually how the sort of human rights and civic education need to be working together moving forward. That actually, how does activism look if it is based on the latest science that's emerging so quickly about how our brains work and the connection between essentially neurobiology and our politics? But to really sum it up, I think the most important takeaway is this idea that the story we tell today is the action we take tomorrow, which means human beings, we learn behavior from what we see. And so that means it's not enough in social change to raise awareness about problems or to shame people for doing the wrong thing. We have to put in front of people the change we want to see happening. And I actually think that's quite a big change again, I'm going to use the word activism, but when I say activism, I'm thinking of a really broad swathe of any work that's actually, trying to improve society. So essentially, this insight comes from this idea that we've had this sense for a long time that sunlight disinfects if you bring to light corruption, say through investigative journalism. You expose the corrupt politician, and then they're shamed into, resigning, or people won't vote for them anymore. And I don't think I need to explain how that's not happening anymore. And so this requires a shift of strategy based on the insight that actually sunlight makes things grow, including attitudes and behavior and culture. And so, first of all, this means we have to start with our storytelling, shining that light on what we want more of, which again is quite a big shift in our society. That's based on the news and on activism against things, but it also brings about a change maybe in what we think of activism, right? Because if the story we tell today is the action we take tomorrow, that puts communication right at the heart of social change efforts, right? Because again, this communication is so important actually in shaping how we feel, how we think, and essentially how we act. So this is this key concept that we're trying to bring about. So this is why this shift becomes so important, right? Are you in your daily work shining more of a light on the things you want less of or on the stuff you want more of? And this is the kind of thinking, the kind of questions we're trying to encourage people to ask themselves with hope-based communication. And the other element then of this neuroscience, this different way of thinking, is that actually we're seeing increasing evidence now that kindness, empathy, compassion, the stuff that healthy societies are based on, are actually like muscles that can be trained. And so again, I think definitely how I used to work in human rights communication before I discovered the brain science was I was kind of taking for granted things like the basic underlying beliefs and values that underpin human rights. And I started to realize, actually, we can't just say, we had World War II, for example, and then we had these human rights treaties because of what happened. It can never happen again. What we actually need to be doing is constantly articulating and then building the things, the emotions, the values, the ways of being that we need in our society. And starting from this basic principle that, for example, kindness is actually something we can train. The level of togetherness or solidarity within a society, these are things that we can change through, again, our activism. So it's not just, again, about laws and policies. That work is still really important, but we also need to think, how do we build the culture that, say, underpins democracy and rule of law? So then just one quick thing just to let you know about hope-based communication. So as I said before, we are growing this as well. As it started as a method, and then we quickly realized it's also a mindset. And it's also growing into a bit of a movement. This idea with hope-based communication, it's an open source tool. We want anyone to be able to use it, whatever kind of work they're doing. And we train people, whether they just want to practice it themselves. We also train people to be trainers. So I wanted to just say that at the beginning, because if you don't like this approach, that's totally fine. You're welcome to use little bits of it and take away some of the ideas. But if you really like it, you're welcome to become part of this community and learn about it. And actually, we're working this summer on building an online training community where you'll be easier access to sort of the basic course material all the way up to becoming a certified hope-based trainer. So Camelia, for example, is one of these trained hope-based experts, which is why she gave you such a brilliant introduction of the approach at the start. Okay, so let's get into the 5 shifts. So we're starting on our shift 1, fear to hope. It's originally where we look at the level of emotions. How do we need people to feel? So the starting point for me developing this approach is, as a human rights communicator, looking around the world in the last few years and just seeing where's the love, essentially, but like genuinely, where's the compassion, the empathy for, let's say, people on the move, people fleeing war and persecution, and recognizing that I need to understand more of the science of what makes people care if I'm actually going to bring that about. And so this leads me to the first basic insight from neuroscience. This is a bit of a simplification, but I think it's a nice way to sort of enter this thinking of how our brains work. And this basic concept that we have this upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. And the downstairs brain here is meant to reflect this instinct that all human beings are equipped with, which is a fight or flight response, which you may have heard of. It's increasingly common parlance in so many areas of life. That essentially, when we're under threat, we go into defensive mode. Our heart rate might increase, we might start sweating. Essentially, our body is preparing, right, to fight or to run away from the danger. And so the key thing here is that in order to do that, our brain is then going to shut down less essential functions to our immediate survival, which means sort of reflective thinking, thinking of the future, thinking about the perspective of other people. Because our brain doesn't have time to do all those things if we're in danger, right? We have to run away. So the problem with that is that fight or flight response is what we also use when we are reading about, let's say, climate change or any other threats to democracy or the potential of war. So you've probably heard of the concept of doom scrolling, for example. That's our brain, when we just can't stop reading the news. That again is our brain fulfilling that same function of keeping us safe. Like, where's the potential danger? In fact, one way I sort of made this connection between the science and my own life is my grandfather was a refugee, and he used to spend most of the day in his room. This was before the internet, just listening to the news on the radio. And my mother explained it's because he's waiting for the next time they have to run away. He's just constantly monitoring the news because who knows when there'll next be a threat and he needs to flee again. So I think that's quite a good example. It's not necessarily that explicit for people who haven't been refugees before, but the point is that's our brain's function, is to keep us safe from danger. And so the part of that brain that's there for us to run away from danger, we haven't actually evolved a different part of our brain to read the news, to scroll on social media. And this fight or flight response is meant to be switched on, run away from the saber-toothed tiger, and then turn it off again. It hasn't been designed to constantly deal with anxiety, worry, stress, stories of other people suffering, climate change, economic uncertainty. Our brain really hates uncertainty. This is really important for when the populists come in, so we'll come back to that. The really damaging thing, though, about being down in this downstairs brain is that this empathy and compassion I talked about resides in a different part of our brain. It's the upstairs brain here that we see, and it's actually triggered when we're feeling safe. And if you think about it, it's kind of common sense, right? Like if there's a threat, naturally to take care of ourselves and people like us. And if we're feeling a bit more safe, then we can think of humanity and that bigger picture. Just think of it like this, right? If there's a knock on a door on a dark, stormy night, if you're feeling in a place of fear, you're a lot less likely to open a door to a stranger than if it's a nice sunny day, the birds are singing, you feel really safe. And just try and project that onto a societal level, right? So societies that feel deep sense of fear are less welcoming to outsiders than societies that feel confident and strong. And so you can already hopefully start to see the implications for that. So this is our basic starting point, right? If this is true, and this science is like really evolving really quickly, a lot of conversations between different neuroscience about how this works, but this basic principle of being in this place of fear is actually a lot less helpful for, well, let's say societies where we take care of each other. And crucially, there's some beautiful writing by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who talks about, she wrote this book, Monarchy of Fear, right after Donald Trump's first election, which talks about how democracies are built on trust. So very upstairs brain, right, where we share power with our fellow citizens. And the monarch or the authoritarian wants us to be afraid. They want us to fear our fellow citizens and think worse of them, because then we'll trust a strong leader to keep us safe from danger. So that's already starting to, like, this is the first connection between our brain and our biology to our politics. There's also this other element, like I was saying, about just how we behave ourselves. And so on a daily basis, we are trying to develop complex strategies to improve our societies. Do we want to be in this reactive mode where our brain is just acting impulsively without thinking? Or do we want to be in a more reflective state where we're, say, maybe ready to think about other people's perspectives, change our own mind, and just think of the common good? And so I think another element of this that is going to become very relevant in our daily practice of our work is what's called self-regulation. So our own ability to actually make sure we are in our upstairs brain, not our downstairs brain. And I'm going to show a little video from this lovely film, Inside Out, which I like to frame as my brain on Twitter. And it's literally, actually, I mean, I've been on LinkedIn a bit more than usual the last week to promote this event and some others. And I already feel actually that I'm in my downstairs brain a lot more. But I think this will illustrate a little bit what it looks like to be in our downstairs versus our upstairs brain.
Here we go. All right, open.
This looks new.
Think it's safe?
What is it?
Okay, caution. There is a dangerous smell, people. Hold on, what is that?
This is disgust. She basically keeps Riley from being poisoned, physically and socially.
That is not brightly colored or shaped like a dinosaur. Hold on, guys. It's broccoli! Yucky! Well, I just saved our lives. Yeah, you're welcome.
Riley, if you don't eat your dinner, you're not going to get any dessert.
Wait, did he just say we couldn't have dessert?
That's anger. He cares very deeply about things being fair.
So that's how you want to play it, old man? No dessert? Oh, sure. We'll eat our dinner right after you eat this.
Right. Here comes an airplane.
Oh, airplane. We got an airplane, everybody.
So there's something I want you to hold on to, which we're going to come back to. The really important point was, did you see the role of disgust in being really suspicious of something that was unfamiliar? So this goes back to that point I was making. That's our brain's job, is to keep us safe from things that are unfamiliar. So remember, I talked about social change, right? We need people to eat their broccoli. How do we get them to start being familiar with broccoli? And then obviously we saw when we didn't get what we want, anger took over, got very impulsive, and then suddenly a bit of joy and fun came into it, and we were a lot more receptive. So what we're going to see here today is actually, I think a lot of us still think, okay, I'm going to make a really effective argument, and that's going to change people's mind. And what the psychology, the neurobiology opens us up to is actually, it's not always an intellectual, clever argument that is going to change things, but it's actually how we feel. And so on a basic level, what this means is, can we, sometimes we might need to say, this leader is very dangerous. But what I want us to do with hub-based communication is to stop and say, okay, we know that already. What if creating the fear is actually adding to this wider environment of fear, and what is the emotion and the thinking I need in order to resist? And so can I offer an alternative to the populism? So we know on a very basic level what populists are trying to do: scapegoat, fearmonger. When people feel fear, they tell our brain, here's who you can blame for that fear. I'm not going to go into that in detail. The problem is sometimes in our campaigning and in our news, they're inadvertently adding to that fear. And so this is why we need, someone has to actually step in and show people, give people that sense of agency, control. And so we'll have a look at how we do that. I think for time, I'm actually not going to show you these clips. I'm going to share the slides with anyone who wants to see them later. But what you see in these videos is, actually maybe I'm going to show you just a few minutes of both. But essentially, just want to show you the difference between campaigning built on what you stand for versus campaigning that's just reacting to your opponent. So I'm going to first show you how it started, and I'll show you how it ended.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve.
Wrong way around. So this was the campaign clip that Kamala Harris launched right at the start of her campaign last year.
In this election, we each face a question. What kind of country do we want to live in? There are some people who think we should be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate. But us, we choose something different. We choose freedom.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. Yeah. Freedom, freedom, where are you? 'Cause I need freedom too.
The freedom not just to get by, but get ahead. The freedom to be safe from gun violence. The freedom to make decisions about your own body. We choose a future where no child lives in poverty, where we can all afford health care, where no one is above the law. We believe in the promise of America, and we're ready to fight for it. Because when we fight, we win. So join us. Go to KamalaHarris.com and let's get to work.
I'ma keep on running 'cause the winner don't quit on themselves.
Okay, so I ended playing that to the end because I just had to get to that little bit at the end. So just note, how did that make you feel, right? For me, I definitely felt goosebumps. Then towards the end of the campaign, see if you can notice a difference in tone and messaging.
With this message.
Donald Trump makes a lot of promises, but we can be sure of one thing. If he wins, he'll ignore all checks that rein in a president's power. It's all in Trump's Project 2025 agenda. What does that
So I'm not even going to go in because basically, spoiler alert, it's all about Trump. And so this was quite similar to Hillary Clinton's campaign and many, many campaigns around the world, is that it starts out with this focus on values, what Kamala Harris stands for, what she offers. And then there's so much objectionable stuff coming from the opponent that you just can't help but rebut it. This is an inbuilt negativity bias that we all have because our body is trying to keep us safe from that broccoli. And so with hope-based communication, we still would call out Trump, like you saw there was like 5 seconds in the original video about Trump, but we have to put it in the context of the alternative we're offering. And so what happens when we let the little red guy take over and become reactive is we just become part of the populist story, and we don't tell our own story. We don't offer the alternative. So this is what we're trying to achieve on a very basic level, is to try not to be as reactive and more focused on the thing we want. Because if we want change, we have to show the change we want to see happen. So a wonderful example of that, one of the few politicians around the world to actually successfully defeat populists, it's called Ekrem İmamoğlu. He's won the mayor of Istanbul campaign twice. I think if there's a lot of stuff happening now in Istanbul about that, I think primarily because the populist leader is so afraid of him. But he made this wonderful campaign playbook called the Book of Radical Love, where he advises people to ignore your opponent and love their supporters. And his strategy, his slogan was, "It's going to be okay if we have hope." So very much triggering the upstairs brain. So essentially the strategy was to get their, in so many words, was to get their supporters into this upstairs brain space and avoid a confrontation with the populist. So that's our starting point. Then we go into some more shifts where we get a bit more practical, right? So maybe the emotional stuff doesn't quite sit with you. Maybe your work's very technical. Well, then we can look at problem solution, which means if all we do is talk about the problem, it becomes a new reference point for people. and they just accept that's how things are. So the idea here is that whenever we talk about a problem, can we also show people what the solution is? So put the problem in the context of our alternative, how things should be instead. And what's important here, just quickly coming back to our brain, is again, our brains are predictive machines. They're constantly making a picture of how the world works based on our existing experience. The vast majority of our thinking is subconscious. So our brain decides how to act in the moment based not on thinking everything through. Our brain acts in milliseconds and then later rationalizes what we've done. This also applies to our politics. And so again, this is this reason why it's so important that we put the change we want in front of people. Because if we want change, as in we want things to be different from how they are, people need to start to become familiar with that change if they're going to support it. So a very basic level, right? Climate change. We have this strong motivation to talk about the problem because this is such an urgent crisis. But the problem is what we've seen over the last few years is increasing, well, decades, right? Increasing levels of urgency. But essentially people seem to have become tranquilized and numb to it. And like, if we're doomed, is it worth making the big changes that people are asking of us? And so actually, if we come about it from a solutions point of view, maybe we start thinking, what is the way we can genuinely build enthusiasm and support for the changes we want? So on a very practical level, the first step is show people how society would look if our solution was implemented, and can we show people how they would get there? So this is an example of one policy showing, okay, we will take fossil fuel workers and train them to install solar panels. So I'm giving you the example of climate change, but the point is to ask yourself, for whatever it is you want, can you show people the solution? Can we show how they get there, right? Do we want polluted city? Do we want clean air? So it's kind of easy for this example, but this is the thinking we have to do for whatever it is we're working on. And eventually show people a big picture vision that actually here's a society where, for example, human beings live in harmony with nature, to show on the horizon there is this possibility. Rather than only showing the doom scenario, it starts to become inevitable in our brains. We have to get our brain familiar with the alternative possibilities. I'm going to skip a couple of slides just to make sure I get through. So essentially, just coming back to the basic shifts, right? The basic way these work is, a lot of the time when we're problem focused, we might say we want the world without. So this was, for example, a slogan that gig workers had, right? Like imagining a world without big tech. But what we want to do is ask ourselves, well, what do we want instead? Right? It's easy a lot of our campaigning might be like taking things out, taking fossil fuel. It's quite easy to articulate what we want out of the world. But for that brain of ours, which is trying to make a picture of the future, we also have to show people what we want instead. So the idea, again, is to start training ourselves. When we say, here's what we want to get rid of, can we also say, well, here's what we're going to have more of instead? So that your audience can imagine yourself in this world we're trying to create. What would the world look like with more democracy, with more civic space, if our societies became, let's say, more European? All right, so I've gone through that shift quite quickly just to give you the taste of it. Our next shift is about, again, shifting from talking about what we're against to what we're for. So like I said, we have this built-in negativity bias, which makes us really reactive. This is in our daily life, but it's also in our politics. And again, it's actually just about training ourselves to pause and reflect, okay, I'm tempted to say what I'm against, but can I actually tell people what I'm for instead? Because maybe that might be more effective. The way this plays out on sort of frontline human rights activism is we're saying migration is not a crime. We shouldn't treat refugees like criminals. The basic problem here is that we're actually end up then reinforcing this idea. The brain science behind it is what you fight, you feed. So this plays out on the level of slogans, but also just plays out on, if a populist says something that's untrue and we then rebut it, we're actually reinforcing that idea. So hearing a fake news 3 times actually starts to make it feel true. Remember what I said about familiarity and the brain? So the point is, again, to be aware and recognize when we're being reactive and say, okay, what is it I want people to know about migration or refugees or journalism? And can I say that instead? So to not react to the people spreading lies, but actually do a better job of telling the story of the truth. So for example, in migration, it means actually saying, we want to bring people here. We want an open, welcoming, diverse society. And sometimes it's easier to just say what we're against because, oh, what if people criticize us? They'll say we're naive. They'll say we're radical. And so a lot of the time, we're not actually saying what we're for because we feel vulnerable. We feel like people aren't ready to hear it. But this is the key point of both, well, hope-based communication is inspired by this messaging expert from the United States, Anachenko Osorio. And her point is, if you're going to do strategic communication, if you're going to do messaging, you don't just say what's popular today. You want to change what's popular. We want to make popular what needs to be said. So we believe that we need to live in a world where, say, people care about each other, where people are open to people who are different. Well, what is it we need to do to actually make that popular so that actually it becomes common sense for politicians to welcome others rather than what's common sense today? So really, actually, what this work is about fundamentally is about making compassion common sense. And again, on a very practical level, it's just about asking ourselves, I'm against, let's say, hate. What am I actually for? And again, I might use this just to change my messaging in a slogan. But if I actually ask myself, well, I'm against racism, what's the exact opposite of racism? What's the opposite of hate? It's actually love. And am I gonna, might feel a bit uncomfortable. Am I, as a human rights campaigner, going to start talking about love? It feels a bit soft, a bit naive. But actually, if that's what I'm for, actually, I'm about people caring for other human beings just because they're human. And so the idea is when you start carrying out these shifts, you start to recognize there are new strategies you need to start implementing. And that dovetails nicely with the science I mentioned earlier, that actually seeing other human beings being kind to each other might actually make me more primed to be kinder myself. So that's the very basic element, right? So I'm against authoritarianism. Well, what do I actually want instead? Oh, maybe it's a more participatory democracy. Well, what is the strategies to counter authoritarianism might be quite different to the strategies you use to get more people involved in democracy. Maybe instead of talking about the threats, maybe I actually need to start reminding people what democracy looks like, why it's good, why people should get involved. So these are examples. The point is anyone can practice these things themselves. So I realize now I've taken a bit of time to get through these. So what I'm going to do is just quickly talk you through the other shifts, and I'll skip some of this stuff. So just briefly, talk you through the last two shifts, and I can pause for questions, and I can always do a few extra slides at the end. So I've talked you through the first three slides today. The last two slides, threat to opportunity and victim to human. So with threat to opportunity, we want to ask ourselves, how are we pushing people to act differently? And so a lot of the time we're going to use a threat. So, if we don't support us, or if you don't vote this way, we're going to say, lose our democracy. Or we might say, you feel guilty because these people are suffering and you haven't acted. Or, imagine your rights were taken away. And this is still an appeal to that downstairs brain. So what we want to ask ourselves is, rather than giving people that threat, can we actually give them an opportunity to do the right thing? And can we give them ways to act that will actually drive this good behavior? So for that, I'm going to show you a nice example of a new video that just came out. But the key insight here is, if you want to change someone's mind or behavior, show someone else changing their mind or behavior. So here's an example of showing people how everyone can be part of sort of the Pride movement through the actions they do. And this is a wonderful ad from Oslo Pride, just came out I think last week, and there's no words in it, but you can just see how it's showing people how to undertake an action. And so what I'd like you to think about when you're looking at this is, what does it look like to be part of your cause or your movement? So what are actions people can take, as opposed to passive actions that like signing a petition or sharing a post, but actually, what does it look like to, let's say, do human rights? And this, I think, is where human rights meets civic education, because if we need, let's say, more trusting society, more empathy, more care, we need to start thinking about like what are actual actions people can take that will reinforce those beliefs, those emotions, those feelings. So let's have a quick look at this. So I don't think you need to be LGBTQ plus to actually feel the emotions that you saw people feel. And the message is just, it's the simple act of having this symbol can have a really positive impact on other people. So it's act of kindness. But this is because of a very handy thing we humans have called mirror neurons. So we have these neurons that mirror the emotions of what we see in front of us. So I think that's really a powerful version of, example of storytelling. And that'll bring me maybe to the point I'll end the talk at, which is just this concept of how narratives change. So with our final shift, victim to human, what we want to talk about is less, sort of, let's say, poverty porn, so showing someone suffering, and more showing stories that drive our attitudes, our behavior, and our culture. And the idea is that narratives are like mosaics. So the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works are built up with loads and loads of different stories. And so the storytelling strategy of shaping the societies we want is to think of this mosaic and think, what is the idea, the belief that underpins the world I want to see? And how can I ensure a flow of those stories? So for example, there's this wonderful campaign in India called the India Love Project. And rather than calling out the worrying trend of Islamophobia that's coming from the far right there, it's a flow of stories about people having relationships from different backgrounds. So it's literally building story by story a narrative of multiculturalism. And so the point is, when we start getting more strategic with this hope-based approach, the idea is we have to, with a longer hope-based workshop, what we try and do is articulate what is the narrative we want to build, and then what are the stories that bring that narrative to life. And then once we can do that, we can start to actually build a strategy of using stories to actually shape attitude, behavior, culture. And so I think that there's a lot of more interesting neuroscience behind that, which we can talk about now in our questions and answers. I'm going to pause and unshare my screen. Lots more stuff I'd love to share with you, but I think I'd really like to just first check in with your questions and reflections. What do you think, Amelia?
Thank you so much, Thomas. I think there is so much more to say, but indeed we only have this 60 minutes, so I'm just going to go ahead and invite Marcus to, Marcus, if you would like, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. I think it's a really essential question, especially in the field of civic education, because the tolerance of ambiguity is something that's been talked about quite a lot recently, and especially, not only recently, I mean, since the RFCDC came out, and this is the reference framework of competencies for democratic culture. And the work behind this framework actually shows that building tolerance of ambiguity is one of the greatest challenges in civic education. So I love Marcus's question, and Marcus, would you like to step in?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for your brilliant speech. So, yeah, and as I wrote in the chat, so my question is, explores two possible roles of hope-based communication in relation to ambiguity tolerance. So the first one is presupposed. So does, in your opinion, hope-based communication require a certain level of ambiguity tolerance to be effective? And the second one is is there possible to promote? So can hope-based communication actively foster ambiguity tolerance in others?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's a wonderful question, and I actually love the way you framed it, because I mean, yes, I think it's a short answer, but I mean, you've kind of really summed up. I think hope-based communication starts from the starting point of recognizing, as you say, ambiguity being this challenge for our brains, and so which is why I think a lot of social change communication, let's say, and I also am thinking of institutional communication. I used to work in the European Commission. Is highly ambiguous because primarily very technical, but also uses so much jargon. And so either we use terms that don't actually resonate with people, or we're just leaving a large part of our story unsaid. You know, why human rights matters, why democracy is a good thing. You know, a lot of the basic core values that underpin a lot of the work we do, you know, which actually comes back to like kindness and love and caring, we leave unsaid. And hence the ambiguity, we're leaving a gap in the mind of our audience that will become filled by other people. So on a basic level, I think, you know, like I talked about these personal hope-based shifts, it's just training all of us to fill in these gaps because ambiguity is such a powerful force. But then, yes, as you say, you come with this deeper question of can hope-based actually also help people with it? The way I think it's also articulated, let's say in a social change or progressive spaces, is this idea of complexity, and how do we introduce complex storytellings? And I think there, yes, it also is effective because in a longer presentation, I was just getting to it, but I look at underlying narrative is this idea of worldview, or essentially how we see the world, the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works. And I think it's maybe perhaps offering people the framework within which to understand how things work, and the framework for this more sort of, you know, complex understanding of the world. So I think it's part of that is just, again, giving people what is that, you know, this worldview, as in, so for example, you know, is human nature to be kind and care for each other, or is human nature that we all look after ourselves? You know, is it survival of the fittest? And we see a lot of that in our politics. To me, I would actually summarize today's politics as a fight between whether politics should be cruel or kind, essentially. But yeah, and then I think one extra piece that comes in with our storytelling is, you know, I'm particularly as a human rights communicator focused on how do we build compassion and empathy among group 1 for group 2, let's say. And I think that's a very good example of that, where a lot of racism actually is based on just having a very simplistic picture of the other, let's say. And what our job is to actually make that more complex, make people more curious and open-minded about the other. Part of that is that's kind of storytelling, like I showed you this stories from India. But what the science there is suggesting that it's, you know, one thing is to tell the story that shows this other in a better light, but we need with that, again, that worldview. And I think so the goal actually is for us to just actually move away from the idea that communication can be neutral, that because no matter how scientific or legalistic we are, there's always an underlying story about the basics of how the world works. But I think this is a much longer conversation to have. And I also stress that I'm not an expert actually in any of the psychology. I'm just a communication person who sees it's really relevant to our work. So I really, you know, hope that those of us who are interested in this can keep going with the conversation. And I think the last thing to say on this is, hopefully I've stressed this, but hope-based communication, it's quite a new tool and it's evolving. And we're basically, as we use it to help people react to this dark moment we find ourselves in, we're finding all these new ways that it can and should be used. So again, it's also an invitation to anyone who wants to be part of actually evolving this tool. And that's where I'm seeing actually that on a basic level, we need to change, how we work in the media. But I'm also seeing actually that a future of human rights work is just being in civic education and training people to have empathy and to be more open-minded to others. I think essentially, it's, as the technology just make facts so available to us, really our future work is at that front line of making sure that essentially we can be better human beings in this complex world.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And then we have a question by Irene or Irene. Irene, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? It's very similar, but it goes again into the direction of ambiguity.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Thomas. Such clear, just so clear. So I guess it's ambiguous, but I think my question is slightly less profound than Marcus, because it's more about what are the limit. It's almost like figuring out what are the boundaries, what's in and outside of the container of what makes something hope-based, right? And so when I saw Claudia Scheinbaum's campaign message, I was like, I don't know, because it was like it hope, but it's also it's pugilistic, it's about fighting. And so I would be intrigued by what you say of that. I mean, her platform that she went on is very positive and is very inclusive, very human rights. So I was intrigued by that ambiguity. And so any thoughts on it's a fuzzy boundary, but what's the boundary, about something from your perspective, what might or might not work well or better?
Yeah, this is a really great question, a really great example as well, actually. And I also am very inspired by Claudia Scheinbaum's campaign and her victory. So I think that my general approach is to try not to set too many boundaries, again, because for me, it's about people articulating for themselves. And so I do think there is the space to have that, as you say, more pugilistic language. I think there's a key piece, actually, which you spoke to, is what I like to say is, and I realize actually it's originally inspired by Barack Obama, but basically what you do is your narrative. So it's not just about the words you use, but actually much more the actions you take. When I realized actually that I just saw a statue in Geneva of Mahatma Gandhi where he said, "My life is the message." So the point is that sometimes you can use words that might feel hope-based or fear-based, but really it's about how you carry out your campaign. And that's where I think Claudia Scheinbaum was very hope-based. But it's also, I think, this message of like hope wins, let's say, is also quite built on agency. So the belief that we can win. So I think that's also the element where it would be hope-based. What's a harder question is more, so for example, I was once in an event where a fellow co-panelist was doing essentially, it's just PR for Saudi Arabia and calling it hope-based. And it was just a video of like, oh, look, here's a fashion show with celebrities in Saudi Arabia. And like, so, one of the one sort of worry I have as we do spread hope-based in this open shared way is what happens if people use hope-based communication with ill intentions. And that's where I would say, actually, to me, that is an example of what was positive campaigning, right? Because it's saying, oh, things are great. And I would say, to me, I think what makes something hope-based is actually an element of something radical, because we're showing something that doesn't yet exist, because we're trying to bring something new into the world that isn't yet there. So to me, that's the way we actually recognize whether something is hope-based or not. But again, it's still an open conversation, I think, for people to talk about. And thanks for sharing that great point. Maybe we should have time for squeeze in one more, maybe?
We don't have any further questions in the chat, but maybe I can ask a very practical question. So let's say I am a civil society organization and would like to start reframing my messaging from tomorrow. What are the tools out there that I can use to help me frame a positive narrative and just fill this gap that this void that people see only when they see the problem but don't see the solution?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Thank you. So this is a perfect example. I've mentioned a lot of these two kind of directions that we find when we start doing hope-based work with people. We see these really big sort of almost gaps. So for example, me with the human rights movement, I think it's quite hard for human rights colleagues to hear me because I'm saying we actually need teams of empathy experts and behavioralists to be going out and actually training human beings around the world and having more compassion for their fellow human being. That feels like a lot, right? To just suddenly hire entire new teams. So there is this longer thinking, I think, stepping back and asking ourselves, what is this society we're trying to build? And are we building that with our day-to-day work? However, in the short term, the way we've built hope-based on a practical level is just these shifts. It's about asking ourselves, all of us as individuals, in everything we do day by day, have I just talked about the problem? Am I also talking about the solution? Am I just reacting to what I'm against? Or am I actually putting forward what we're for? And that's what we really want to try and train people to do. And again, it is this mixing with psychology, because really, to a certain extent, it's like this concept of self-regulation, of our own ability to manage our brain and how we're reacting. And so, yeah, I'm actually just in the process of revising all these tools, but we'll essentially be sharing really soon with the launch of our new platform, a basic hope-based shift guide for anyone who wants to apply the shifts, a basic checklist people can use, together then with some more of those deeper strategy tools.
Amazing, really amazing. And I look forward to this release. And it's also good to know that you have prepared these and they are free to use. Everyone, thank you so much for joining today. We are right on time.